Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Burton. He graduated from Yale University and the University of California at San Francisco Medical School, where he also completed his neurology residency. At age 33, he was appointed Chief of Division of Neurology at UCSF Medical Center at Mount Zion, where he subsequently became Associate Chief of the Department of Neurosciences. His books include On Being Certain, Believing You Are Right Even When You're Not, A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, What Neuroscience Can and Cannot Tell Us About Ourselves, and 3 critically acclaimed novels. He has also written essays, book reviews, and op-ed pieces for the New York Times, Salon.com, Aeon, and Nautilus. So, Dr. Burton, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So, I've invited you because I found your books very interesting, and on my show, one of the biggest topics that we explore here has to do with human nature and how our minds work and things like that. So, and it's very interesting because in your books you talk a lot about how people have these feelings of certainty, of knowing, of familiarity, and clarity of thought and things like that. And I guess that is at least somewhat problematic because people are wrong a lot of the time about particularly where their thoughts come from and in terms of evaluating, for example, evidence properly. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, in your book you talk about all of these different feelings that people have. Would you say that or would you classify them as several different forms of self-deception or not?
No, actually, I don't know if self-deception is the right word. Let me just back up for a second. When I was a young medical student and deciding what to go into, there was an article where Wilder Penfield, who was one of the great neurosurgeons of the mid-century, and he did like 25 years of exploring the human brain, where he would stimulate conscious patients when they were having surgery for epilepsy. And he would ask them various questions. And what he elicited were a large number of what he called psychomotor or psychophysiologic responses. In other words, responses of mental sensations that occurred exclusively through stimulation. But one of the things that was interesting that he stimulated caused things like déjà vu, a sense of oneness with the universe, feelings of knowing that everything is right, unassociated with a thought. In other words, there was no antecedent thought that triggered the feeling. The feeling came out of the blue. And so I realized, well, there have to be systems in place in the brain that will stimulate these feelings under certain circumstances. Now, I don't use the word self-deceptive because in part we need to have feelings of knowing in order to accomplish anything. In other words, if you're going to start a project, be it a research project or a novel, you have to at least have a hunch that you're going to be on the right track. So you have to have some sense of knowing that it's right, even before you have any evidence that it's right. So, for example, I started a novel once that I didn't finish. I said, why did I start that? Well, I started it because I thought it was going to be good. And then after I got into it, I said, oh, this is horrible. So, but I needed that in order to prompt me into the next steps. So one of the purposes of having feelings of knowing is to solve the question of, yes, but this could be right, but there's something wrong. Maybe there's something wrong, yes, but it could be something else. Finally, you have to come to a decision. So it serves the value of being a decision maker, or it stops the infinite regression of yes, but, and it also serves as motivation. So when you use the word self-deceptive, only in the sense that lots of what we do is self-deceptive, but not specifically, it isn't specifically for that purpose. It has both positive and negative attributes that we've evolved.
Mm-hmm. So, at a certain point there, you referred to the fact that back then when you were a medical student and things like that, that you thought that many of these mental mechanisms should have underlying neurological, some sort of neurological basis to them, let's put it that way. So is it the case that we've already been able to identify some, for example, brain centers that give a basis to all of these feelings of knowing and certainty? And is it the case that they all stem from the same neurological basis, or not?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. Even though there are studies that have shown, yes, there are certain areas that give you a sense or a feeling of knowing, it isn't quite that simple. And I don't think there's like a single center where you press a button and it goes feeling of knowing yes, and other centers no. But it's clear that there are multiple areas in the brain that you stimulate, and everybody argues as to which is the most important. I don't think it's terribly important because it's widely distributed. For example, if you see a face, you get a feeling of knowing that might originate in the occipital region, and if you have a sense of smell and say that's a flower, now maybe there's a central area that controls this, but they haven't identified a central area because the feeling is widely distributed amongst a wide variety of functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I guess that when we have these feelings of knowing or feelings of certainty, we have to integrate information from several different areas and mental mechanisms, let's say, like, for example, perceptual systems, memory, and things like that, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the phrase I use is the phenomena is widely distributed, though the origin of the actual feeling might be more localized, but nobody knows exactly where it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I guess that nowadays people in neuroscience have mostly abandoned that approach of trying to pin down specific areas that only process one sort of information, or, for example, if we're talking about different mental mechanisms, trying to pin down a specific location where they are processed or something like that, but they are thinking more about maybe brain systems and neural circuits from different areas of the brain, right?
And one of the easiest ways, in a very short way, to think about this is people tend to think binary. It's either here or it's there. But the fact of the matter is most of these functions are distributed like a bell-shaped curve. So that's maybe maximal in one particular area, but it doesn't mean that it's not elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, do you have a system of classification for the different types of feelings that you talk about in your books, or are they interrelated in any way?
Well, the original studies, which I've sort of expanded on, are familiar versus strange. Mm-hmm. And a simple way to think about this is a déjà vu phenomenon, which we've all had, is a feeling of familiarity. And a jamais vu, never seen in French, is this is strange. So, and I'm sure you've had the experience of going to a new place you've never been before and you feel really good about it. Right. You say, this feels wonderful, and it feels like you've been there before. Other places you go, you feel a sense of alienation. This is awful, unpleasant. I've never had this experience before, and that is a sense of alienation. But those feelings arise out of sort of the two poles of the feeling of knowing on the one hand, certainty, which would start at the lowest level would be a hunch, a gut feeling, an intuition. Yes, that's right. I know that's right. I'm certain that's right. To the most profound but spontaneous one is the aha. People get an aha. You can't generate an aha through your thinking. There's no way. It just happens to you. And the other hand would be, doesn't feel quite right. This is awful. This is terrible. This is bizarre. This is strange. This is horrible. And in the Wilder-Penfield studies, people would typically say, this feels strange, odd, otherworldly for the negative. And the other would say, this is wonderful, sublime on the positive side.
And do we know why people have those mechanisms? I mean, and particularly from an evolutionary perspective, do we already have some sort of explanation as to why people evolved these feelings of knowing, certainty, familiarity, and so on?
Well, evolutionary psychology would be an easy way to explain it. I don't know if it's true, however. So let me try it this way. If you take a slime mold can conglomerate into a large clump of stuff that has intention, can solve a problem, it can solve a maze, it can find oat bran taking the shortest circuit. So in a sense, it has intention, purpose, and I don't know what you would call it thought, but you would call it something, some decision-making ability. Now move up the scale, and eventually you get to where bacteria, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually you get to human beings who are conscious. Now, if you're conscious, you have added another dimension into your experience, which is conscious feelings about the rightness of your decision. Now, the slime mold must have some sense that it's doing the right thing as it learns through experience and does it, but it wouldn't be a conscious experience. Right. We, on the other hand, need to have some feeling that motivates us to believe we're going in the right direction, that confirms what we think. So my suspicion is that these feelings evolved on the road to consciousness in order to solve the problem of what do you feel consciously when you're making a decision, etc. So I've actually very simple-mindedly see the decision-making as however the brain makes decisions, and in the case now we think, well, there's embodied cognition, maybe it's not just the brain, maybe it's the entire body, maybe it's even more the body in the case of like locusts who make group decisions. So for the purposes of the discussion today, we'll talk about the brain, but I'm not saying the mind is exclusively the product of the brain. I mean, it's a product, obviously, of the body. You can't talk about a feeling of acceleration unless you've had the feeling of being pressed against the seat of a car for something, etc. Okay, but for the purpose of discussion, as the decision-making ability evolved, it needs something to confirm what it's doing, especially if it's occurring subliminally. Otherwise, you'll be informed of everything. So it's a circuit breaker. It says, okay, there's a 20% chance that you're right, forget it, don't bother. If it's 90% chance, I'm going to pursue that. Right. It's like with facial recognition. You see somebody in a crowd, and it's 1 in 1,000 that somebody. You can't have that all come into consciousness. So you only take the things that are, the most salient, a higher level. So that it serves a purpose in that regard. And it probably evolved as we became more aware of our surroundings, which is the very nature of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you think that these feelings evolved when we were on the road to consciousness, let's say. So is it the case that these feelings also have an unconscious component to them, or not?
Yes, but you see that there's a language problem. Mm-hmm. An unconscious feeling has no meaning, and yet a sensation which occurs in your periphery of your body, which doesn't reach consciousness, is still a sensation. In other words, if you're in the middle of a boxing match and somebody hits you in the jaw and it hurts, but you're so concentrated on boxing that you don't feel the pain in the jaw at all, then it didn't reach consciousness. So it's a real sensation, but at a subliminal level. But that doesn't exactly make sense so when you say feeling normally suggests conscious awareness of it. But yes, they do occur at an unconscious level. And I think you see this most commonly in the discussion of morality, where people are revulsed by something. And so they say that that's bad. They may not feel the revulsion at all. They may have the revulsion rise up. Let's say they see a sight of a 1-month fetus, and that revulses them. They may not consciously go, that's awful. They may go, they shouldn't do abortions. Mm-hmm. The driving force would be a subliminal sensation or feeling. The decision would be a political one. So, and in fact, people like Jonathan Haidt really argue that the whole basis of moral philosophy is feelings of revulsion that arise in places like the insula, and then after the fact, post hoc, you give them a rationalization.
Okay, so I was basically asking you if one of the issues you're also worried about exploring in your books, let's say, is the fact that many times people have intuitions and then only after the fact do they come up with reasons or justifications to them, what we call basically post-hoc rationalization.
That's correct. And if you think about it, probably the fundamental question that is unanswered in neuroscience that has bothered me ever since I started thinking about this and doing these books is, what is the role of conscious thought? Mm-hmm. In other words, on the one hand, you got people who believe that we're conscious, rational, deliberate, contemplative, and you've got other people who, on the other end of the spectrum, believe that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, that all of our decision making occurs underneath. And then you've got all the in-betweens. So you have a bell-shaped curve. One end you have complete rationalists, and on the other hand you've got we're completely subliminally driven organisms. Now, there's no way to study that. There's no way to really do any kind of scientific study that can show whether consciousness can create de novo thought that didn't originate in the unconscious, although it seems quite unlikely. So what you're really left now with, if the vast majority, if not all of thought originates in the subliminal sphere, then you have to think of some mechanism. Well, we don't know what thought is. Nobody knows exactly what a thought is. In the same way as we don't really know how slime mold manipulates how they do, but they have a biologic system that allows them to solve problems. So do bacteria and so on, right? Now, when we get to human beings, we have the concept of thought, which is we made a decision and decided it was correct. But we also have abundant evidence that however this takes place, it's primarily, if not exclusively, unconscious or subconscious. If that's the case, and you divide your way of thinking about these so-called thoughts into a decision-making process and then a separate process that decides the likelihood that that decision is correct, then you have a twofold problem: the problem of making the decisions, and B, the problem of knowing the likelihood that they're correct based upon what? The feeling of correctness. Well, that's not a way in which to decide whether something's correct. So we've evolved science through the years. Science, to the extent that it can be objective and establish evidence, can at least point you in the direction of, yes, if we see that we take a bacteria of someone with TB out of the person with TB and put it in a rat, the rat gets TB, it satisfies the evidence that the TB caused, that the bacterium caused tuberculosis. Okay, so but those situations are few and far between when you get into decision making about whether or not to invade Iraq or immigration policy or those. It's not so simple. So what you're really left with is we have feelings. As I mentioned about the Wilder Penfield, those feelings are separate from the thoughts that they accompany, because you can have them in the absence of those thought. You can have it. You can stimulate those thoughts, those feelings chemically. Like if those people read the William James Varieties of Religious Experience, he talks about nitrous oxide and ether and chloroform, and we now know that ecstasy and other drugs, lots of things create a feeling of knowing that's independent of knowing anything. So if that is a separate system, which you have to argue it is, if you see that it can occur without in the absence of thought, then it's modifying your decision making. But if those feelings occur on their own, then you're subject to those feelings as directly affecting your decision making in the absence of any justification for the feeling. So it's like arguing that a tickle is a justification for a laugh. No, that's not. Tickle might provoke a laugh, but it's not a justification for it. So people come up with funny ideas based upon the sense that they had an intuition, gut feeling, hunch, etc. And it's alarming because for me, people say, I know I'm right. No, they feel they're right. And the difference between feeling you're right and knowing you're right is they're separate worlds. They're not even parallel worlds.
Mm-hmm. I guess that we're also mistaken even about our own thinking, because we have that feeling that when we are thinking that there's a stream of thoughts that is provoked by us, by, I don't know, by a self in our minds, and it is us ourselves who generate those thoughts. But I mean, it seems that in reality they just pop out of we don't know where, and I mean it is not really that we ourselves consciously cause our chain of thoughts and we decide what we really think about.
Well, that's right. You know, I read some poet was describing, well, this occurred to me, then that occurred to me, and then that occurred to me again, then this occurred to me, and that occurred to me, and I thought I was thinking. And but that's each one of those. I mean, everybody's had the experience. Well, that occurred to me, and then and so when you try to think through the relationship between thought and conscious behavior, part of the problem also stems from the fact that we distort our appreciation of time. So cause and effect is the relationship. I thought this, then I thought that. And we tend to think that that's the way the brain actually works, but in fact it doesn't work that way. And I used the example in the book of the guy who's a baseball player. He sees the ball leaving the pitcher's hand. He has to swing, but then he has to swing as soon as the ball leaves the pitcher's hand, because it takes about 0.4 of a second for the ball to reach the plate, and it takes 0.02 of a second for the reaction time, and then another 0.02 of a second for him to swing the bat. So they're approximately the same. So he has to swing right away, but he still describes seeing the ball approach the plate and then deciding whether or not to swing. Now, if you think about trains of thought in the same way, well, I thought this, then I thought that, but they're after the fact, feelings you had about it. There's no way to prove that that's how you actually had this train of thought. So you run into the problem of reason. What's the definition of reason and rationality?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and about that precise definition of reason and rationality, I mean, there's this, I don't know if we should call it weird idea, but there are people, particularly people that are part of the, for example, skeptic community, that think about reason. I mean, they think that we have some sort of mechanism in our heads that if we are to apply it, we are able to arrive at objective truth without the need to sort of looking for empirical evidence. I mean, the people think that there are some truths about the world that we can arrive at just by employing a sort of mechanism that we have in our minds, a cognitive mechanism. I mean, and if we process information in certain ways or something like that, but it's a bit weird, because I guess that the only things that we can come up with without taking into account empirical evidence are our own intuitions, and we don't have any proof that they correspond to something real without empirically testing.
That's absolutely correct. You know, there was this one particularly unusual case of a very prominent cardiovascular surgeon who wanted to study whether or not non-touch massage would help improve his patients. And when someone asked him, why did you come up with that idea? He said, well, I had no a priori notion. And you go, well, if you had no a priori notion, why would you ever come up with the idea? I mean, you could as easily study whether lasagna would help post-operative patients. I mean, but he didn't know he didn't know, because we don't know ourselves very well, or at all to speak of. We give ourselves a benefit, maybe we know ourselves a little speck. We don't know what triggers our thoughts.
Right.
And it makes it dangerous to think that we're rational. Unfortunately, like, for example, you watch a modern day politics, and one of the horrible things you see is that both sides are arguing as though they can convince the other guys through reason, and it works not at all. It's amazing. The best single example against reason is to watch Donald Trump's followers after seeing whatever he's done. There's been no change in the statistics of those people who follow him. I mean, if reason were to prevail, you would think there'd be some change, but on the same hand, the Democrats aren't doing any better. That's just an aside.
Yeah, and it's even more interesting because it seems that it is not facts or empirical evidence that really change people's minds. I mean, if that were the case, then we would simply expose people to that and it would work. But people are very resistant even to the facts. Right.
Well, about 5 years ago, I gave a lecture down at Google, and I, at that time, being a novelist at heart, had a very strong feeling that human beings are unique and have a special kind of thinking. But one of the head of their computational neuroscience division took me aside, and we had this conversation, which led to a friendship. And over the years, I began to reconsider how I've been thinking about the whole concept of brain and thinking. And so let me try an idea out on you from the other way, which is, imagine that you were a deep learning AI machine. You just keep accumulating larger and larger data sets until you get a more refined answer. If you're trying to play poker, you play millions of hands, eventually you learn to be the best poker player, chess player, backgammon, whatever it is. And so the larger the data set, the greater the likelihood that you're going to come up with an appropriate strategy for whatever you're doing. Now, how do you know you're right with artificial intelligence? Well, you have feedback loops. So the way that machines are trained, they're trained so that if they win, they get positive feedback. They lose, they get negative feedback. What's the feedback for thought in human beings? The sense of being right or being wrong. The difference is that the feedback loop in an artificial intelligence deep learning mechanism is the actual outcome. They either win or they lose.
Right.
Kasparov wins or they win. In this case, the outcome is quite different. It's whether you feel you're right. It is not whether or not the decision was right. Those are completely different. So I'm starting to think, well, what can we learn from AI rather than what can we learn about AI? And one of the things that you can learn is that if our feedback, what tells us we're right or wrong, are involuntary mental sensations, then we should acknowledge that and somehow learn how to work with that, though I don't know exactly how. As opposed to, and so when you watch people arguing about whatever the argument of the day is, whether it's creationism or immigration, whatever, they feel they're right. But they have to admit at the same time they don't have evidence to support a subjective moral position because there's no evidence for that kind of thing. So they should say, I feel I'm right, but someone else could feel he's right and have a contrary point of view. But it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that another problem here that we have to take into account is that different people have different brains that are structured in slightly different ways. And so, I mean, we also have, at least to some extent, innate predispositions to process information in slightly different ways because there are maybe some parameters that get tuned in different people in different ways in terms of how they process environmental stimuli, for example. And that's also why I guess we have different personalities. And so, I mean, if we are relying on people's intuitions, then since different people have different intuitions about the world and they think differently, then I guess that we would have a big problem there.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's the whole nature nurture controversy, which has sort of died away, but you know, it sort of lingers on. And when I wrote my last novel, was about 10 identical twins who were cloned and raised apart, and I wanted to create a scenario in which they got together again, how they would feel about each other. So in order to do that, I did a lot of reading and talked with the people who did research on identical twins raised apart who had no exposure. And what's interesting is that there are a large number of traits that seem to be not affected by your environment. One of them, which was the most stunning, is religiosity. The idea that doesn't mean that if two identical twins are raised apart, they'll both be Catholic or whatever. One might be Catholic, one might be Buddhist, one might be Catholic, one might be an atheist. But the thing about it is that they have a strong feeling about their relationship to religion in general. Like for me, I don't have any feeling about religion one way or the other. It's interesting as a cultural phenomenon. It doesn't interest me personally. I'm indifferent. Other people feel very strongly, and I know one of the people, someone you've actually interviewed, who was a born-again Pentecostal, who said he saw the light and became an atheist. But that's just as fervent a belief in the religious sphere. So what I recognize is that it's not just religiosity, but you can do a personality inventory. You can talk about optimism, pessimism, and now there's risk-taking and being versus risk-aversive. And although there's no absolute evidence, there's some studies that show that there are dopamine receptors that are varied in people that are more or less risk-averse. And so if you consider human beings as being a plethora, if not an infinitude of traits, and each one is first of all sort of tweaked before birth or whatever, however you want to look at it, on the basis of inheritance and early childhood development, and then it's further tweaked by culture, it seems pretty obvious that there are no two people who think alike. They see things completely differently. And why you think that they would reason the same way is only if you believe you have conscious reason which can overcome all of these subliminal traits, which there's not a shred of evidence to support.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you refer to religion, because I've already interviewed some major figures in the cognitive science of religion, and I guess that a very big problem that, for example, secular people have, and I mean, I'm a secular person, but even so, is that it's very easy for people to think that we simply could replace, for example, religion and values, whatever sort of values people have, with science and the scientific method. But I mean, then we have the problem also of the is-ought dichotomy. But even putting that aside for a little bit, I guess that I mean, in terms of how people orient their lives, for example, I mean, it's very hard for me to imagine that we could simply rely on science to do that. Even more so because people have different views of the world.
Well, see, and that's really why, to make extraordinarily complex interrelationships, for example, there's this really wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky on behavior recently, and he covers thousands of different variables that affect your behavior, but in the end, we have no understanding of how it works. So at the risk of gross oversimplification, which is what I've done, I see it really, if our reasoning, or whatever you want to call decision-making, occurs at an unconscious level, then it's prompted, again, by the feeling tones that are associated with the decision. So if you want to study whether hands-off prayer or prayer at a distance can help people recover from surgery, I mean, they've done this study endlessly. Before you even do the study, you have to ask yourself, why would I do the study? And what prompted the question that led to you doing that study? Well, it would never occur to me to do such a study because I'm not interested in the role of religion in in healing somebody from surgery.
Right.
But somebody who's religious might be. So he's got an invested, inbuilt but not recognizable bias, and the bias isn't necessarily, bias is a pejorative, it implies that some prejudice, but it isn't a prejudice in this case. It is an innate, inbuilt tendency to move in one direction or another. In the same way, I know that when I make decision making, I've always liked to play poker, and when I make decision making, I'm sort of enjoy risk, but I'm risk aversive at another level. So at some level, these come into conflict. I enjoy the gamble, but I don't want to risk. Other people don't mind at all, and they can give you 1,000 reasons, but they enjoy the risk. So now, if you start thinking about science as morality, which is sort of the question you're asking, is, well, where does the question arise that leads to the study that determines the conclusion? And I'll give you one that's particularly bothersome to me, which you may or may, and I don't mean if I'm wandering off the subject, just let me know.
Sure.
But there's Steven Pinker, who I greatly respect, wrote this book about how violence is declining due to reason. Mm-hmm. Now, my definition of violence and his are different. If, for example, I grew up in San Francisco, and when I was a kid, I grew up across the street from Golden Gate Park. And I played on the tennis team, and at nighttime I walked home in darkness. I was telling some of my young friends about this the other day. They said they would never let their kid walk through Golden Gate Park because it's dangerous. Now, how many deaths have they actually had in Golden Gate Park? Not a lot, but they've had some. Is it more or less? Doesn't make any difference. Because of the tenor of the time, a single act of violence can affect a large number of people. Mm-hmm. So the Golden Gate Park is now considered unsafe. Now, for me, that is a rise in the downside of violent behavior, even though it may be a per capita decline mm-hmm. in the amount of violence. And you say, well, why would you choose this definition of violence, per capita decline, when you can see people are more fearful, they're afraid to go out at night, they don't even want to walk their dog in San Francisco anymore? You follow me? And I thought, well, why would you choose it? And in my way of looking at it is, well, he wants to believe in reason as having accomplished something in the sphere of humanity. At the same time, I'm looking at the way the world's going, and I'm saying that reason may be its cause of its downfall. But each of us comes from our own internal, existential, in my case, skeptical viewpoint. In his case, he's an optimist. And I know that there's a great interview where he had with Daniel Kahneman, where Kahneman says, I'm a natural born pessimist. And Pinker says, I'm an optimist. But that shades the morality of science. You don't have to go any further to see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting when you were talking about religion and religiosity and how religious people particularly might be interested in the positive, for example, health effects that religion might have on them. I guess that could bring us to explore another topic here that you also talk about in your books, that is the placebo effect. Because I mean, even in medicine in general, and also, for example, in clinical psychology and psychiatry, I mean, at a certain point, if people don't have good enough controls, it gets very tricky when they try to distinguish a real effect from a placebo one, because it's very easy to give some suggestions to people and for them to, for example, believe that the treatment will work and then feel better and things like that.
Well, much of life is a placebo effect. I mean, you see somebody who's doesn't look sick, but you want to make them feel better. You say, I think you're looking better. And then they smile. I mean, you look at economics. If things are going badly, you lie to the public and say, economy's getting better, go out and spend more. And then and it actually works. Maybe they spend more and the economy does better. and that's Keynesian economics. So it no matter what it is, placebo and placebo is not real or non-real. Placebo is real, but not in the way that we thought it should work. In other words, it works through stimulation of brain pathways, endorphins, and positive. So a fake or illusory operation or drug that has a real effect. It has not the physiologic effect that was intended, but it still has a physiologic effect.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's very interesting because I mean sometimes even it seems that even people's psychology really translates into a sort of real somatic effect. Right.
Absolutely. And you know, they're one of the first studies on placebo that I thought was interesting is in the very old days, in the very beginning of coronary bypass surgery in the 50s, they did a procedure which turned out not to be useful. They abandoned it. But in order to do it, they did a sham procedure as well. So they did one where they inserted an artery into the heart, an internal memory artery, I think, and another one where they did nothing. They just opened the chest and did nothing. The people where the chest was opened and they did nothing had improvement in their exercise tolerance, their oxygen consumption. These were real physiologic effects from no treatment. And we don't really understand how that works, but it does work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, going back to when you were talking about Steven Pinker's book and Daniel Kahneman, I guess that another thing that we have to be careful about is that, so, I mean, if people have different personalities and they look at the world in different ways, I mean, people as scientists are trying to understand how our minds work. But I mean, they also have to be careful in the sense that the way they do experiments, the way they design them, and the way they interpret the results from them, I mean, they can very easily be contaminated by our own way of intuitively thinking about how the human mind works. Right.
Well, yes, and so, you know, if you there are some measurements that are indisputable to within a small standard deviation of error, such as speed of light. I think nobody would disagree about that. But as you move away from standardized measurements, all bets are off. So if you think about psychiatric medications, how do they decide whether they work? They're designed based upon questionnaires. Mm-hmm. You give questionnaires to the doctors, the nurses, the ward attendants, the patient's family, and they all fill them out. Well, once I worked at UCSF Mount Zion, had a pain clinic, and I was the neurology advisor, and they wanted to see whether or not the clinic worked. So they had this medical anthropologist, PhD, develop a questionnaire they gave to the patients. And he asked one question: do you consider the clinic to have been of value? Yes. Do you consider, and 60% said yes. Do you consider the clinic to have been helpful? 60% yes. Are you better as the result of coming to the clinic? 30% said yes. Now, 60% said the clinic helped them, 60% said that it was useful, only 30% said they were better. Well, 30% is sort of the standard for placebo. Mm-hmm. Why did 60% say that they did better? Well, there are natural inbuilt reasons why people will answer a questionnaire. Well, the doctors are trying to help, they're working hard, you know, they look tired, I'm going to say they helped me. Mm-hmm. Do I actually feel better? No. So if you take psychiatric treatments, for example, a lot of the nurses would say, yes, this drug worked because the patient was more cooperative. which might also imply more placid, more passive, et cetera, et cetera. And so whenever you do social psychology or moral psychology, where you ask people, are you better? You're still run the problem. What is the question? I mean, there was a very famous study. I think I might have had it in one of the books, but I can't remember. In which these people were asked whether or not, if they went on their hunches, their choices were better for buying a car, or whatever, and they said yes. But they don't know whether or not that's in their best interest until they run the whole gamut of how long they own the car. If it breaks, and they use this as an argument for how intuition was good. No, it doesn't work like that. So you really, whenever you're asking a question, you first have to say, how do I obtain irrefutable, universally acceptable evidence? Okay, speed of light, the things that are really obvious, right? Is it raining or not raining? Or maybe not so obvious that it's drizzling. But the further away you get from obvious or agreed upon definitions, the more it is strictly perceptual. And everybody's entitled to their opinion. And that's what ends up being moral psychology, moral philosophy, ethics.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you were referring to how people give questionnaires to clinics and to their patients and their families' patients and so on. And I guess that's perhaps one of the limitations of things like psychiatry and clinical psychology, because to some extent at least clinics, and I'm not saying it's their fault, because I mean it's very hard to come up with good enough alternatives, but they are relying too much on people's reports, and particularly when they're trying to understand, for example, some life events that might have triggered the condition they're in. I mean, of course, they have to rely 100% on people's reports. And as we've been talking during our interview, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that.
Yeah, so basically, one of the reasons I've written these books is in part to understand why people think the way they do, but also to impress upon people the fact that your perception is not my perception. And if it's not, it doesn't mean mine's better or worse than yours. It means that they come from a different perspective. You try to analyze both, make the best decision you can, but recognize there's a lot of room for alternative approaches, that even if you think they're dead wrong, from the other person's perspective, they might seem entirely rational. And this is where that problem with the word rationality comes in. What's good for one person may make another person unhappy, and therefore, from rationally speaking, it's not appropriate for him to pursue it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so just one last question. With all of this that we've been talking during the interview in mind, do you think that we could be able to develop some good approaches to try to at least counter some of the most negative consequences of the way we think, basically?
I've given this a lot of thought, and I'm an optimist at a personal level and a pessimist at the social level. So if you go back to the model that I think is a nice metaphor, even though metaphors always change over time, that we have a decision-making process that is then confirmed to greater or lesser degrees by feelings of knowing, of being right or wrong, so on. And you have two processes. And then you have that right or being wrong is the feedback loop that continues the thinking process, and that the vast majority of thought is subliminal. Then it doesn't do any good to appeal to conscious reason, or very little. And this is why we see a stalemate in virtually everything globally these days, probably all through history. So then the question would be, could we input better information? Well, theoretically, a better designed educational system over a long period of time that would allow people to learn enough so that they then educate their kids, who then educate their kids, and over time they absorb the idea that this is subjective, that the feeling of knowing is subjective, that certainty is a false concept. It doesn't happen overnight. So I see it as a race between our decline in discourse that over the last, since my lifetime, versus the hope that education through generations maybe will make a difference. So you need to change the information, but that's really hard to do. You need to change people's feeling of what is cause and effect, which is extremely difficult to do because that's an inbuilt set of sensations. If A happens and it's followed by B, we believe that B was caused by A, and this is the reason why there are people who don't want to vaccinate their kids because, they got vaccinated, then they got autism. So you have to somehow subvert the belief that we understand causation at the level of feeling. We have to be able to understand that the feelings that we do generate are idiosyncratic. And that would take generations. Maybe of over time, people say, well, the Enlightenment was good for reason, but now maybe we've got to go in the other direction and say reason isn't all it's cracked up to be, and whatever reason we do have tends to occur at the subliminal level. Now, let me just back up 1 second. I've seen some of the really great advances in science over my lifetime. And I've seen some utterly genius stuff, from Einstein to Feynman and all these kind of guys, and you go, of course we're reasonable. Of course we're capable of rational thought. No. These people are geniuses at the subliminal level, and they still carry it on out. And it's the problem that even when I say that, I don't entirely believe it. Because part of me thinks that these guys are geniuses and therefore they're thoughtful, conscious people. And that's because of the mythology of modern life. We actually believe this. We've believed this since Descartes, maybe since Aristotle, but we've always believed this, that we are conscious, we're different from the rest of the animal kingdom. We have this way of wrong, but I can't shake that feeling entirely out of my own self. So why would I expect other people to try and spend the time to do that? Do you follow me? And this is the rub. Somehow we need a new language that acknowledges that we're decision-making organisms, not rational human beings, separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. That's a hard one to swallow, because even I don't entirely, I know it's true, it's hard to believe. And that's part of the problem with pattern recognition and then confirming through your own personal biases. It's a circular logic.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that if we were to provide people with this knowledge about how their minds work and let them pass it over a huge number of generations, let's say, then through some sort of a cultural evolutionary phenomenon, then it would be possible that people would start thinking in different ways? Because I mean, even that, it's a bit hard to imagine because these things are very counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, and that's just the problem is try to tell the baseball player that he didn't see the ball approach the plate before he swung. Even when you show him the physiology, and he has to understand this, and he's not stupid. It's not a matter of stupidity. It's not ignorance. It's not lack of exposure. He knows it perfectly. He says, no, I saw the ball. And you read these guys, they say, I saw the ball approach, and when it was the size of a quarter, it was the size of a $50. No, they saw it after they swung. And this is the same problem. We have these feelings bubble up. We think we thought them, but they've already occurred before, and then they appear in consciousness. And then we have the feeling after the fact. We have a feeling of revulsion after the fact. We say that's a bad idea. It is counterintuitive. I don't know how you overcome that. I mean, I've worked really hard at this. This has been like 15 years since I've been thinking about this, and I still only partly believe it. I mean, you know what I mean by I partly believe.
Right, right. Yeah, okay, so Dr. Burton, let's end the conversation here. Just before we go, I will be leaving links to your books in the description box of the interview. Would you like to tell us about any online places where people can get in touch with more of your work?
I have a little website called rburton, rburton.com, and on there I have some of the stuff that I've written, essays and so on. And I've also published recently some poems and in the neurology journals, and I've written some short stories and some other stuff, some of which is on these issues, and that people might find that, but that'll all be on rburton.com.
Okay, great. So I will include that in the description box of the interview for people to go and check it out because it's all very interesting, particularly the books. I read them and I really loved them, so I really recommend them. So, Dr. Burton, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, likewise.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you also have the alternatives of Subscribestar and PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Gondreanu, Jana Eninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Doctors Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and also my three producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.